Welcome to Gradient Proof, a long-form discussion on a range of topics from AI to philosophy to entrepreneurship. We start each podcast sober and let the proof gradient the course of discussion. As always, we encourage you to drink with us. Welcome to the Gradient.
Stephen and I are in New York City. Topic of today's podcast is going to be about architecture, a little bit about architecture today, and then also maybe where architecture is going in the future. Funny thing about being in New York City, you walk through these man-made canyons here, and you see these buildings that are hundreds of stories tall, built of all types of different materials. One of the interesting things about architecture, I'd say, is you see how it changes in form and how it manifests based on technology. Technology is a huge, super important part of different eras of architecture. So for instance, you couldn't have the New York that you have of today without the development of steel and steel in the building sense, using it for building, but also, the elevator, for instance. I think it was in the book Delirious New York that Rem Koolhaas had written where he talks about, I believe it was Otis. If you know Otis elevators, I think it was first presented by Otis himself at the World Fair, showing that if he were to cut the line of the elevator, he had developed this brake system that would essentially stop it from plummeting down to the ground. So elevators obviously super important, right? If you've ever walk up here, 6 stories high, and then half or so of the way through, realize you forgot something downstairs or forgot to grab the mail, you could see a building that equates to 50 or 60 stories become pretty inefficient, right? And of course, steel. So, one interesting building we would always learn about in school, or at least initially, was the Wainwright building by Louis Sullivan. Louis Sullivan was essentially a mentor of Frank Lloyd Wright, which I think is probably much more notable than Sullivan is. But, they attempted before the use of steel to, build a skyscraper, only using masonry, bricks, CMU, whatever it might have been at the time. And you can look at the building. It's pretty interesting because you'll see that the structure is so thick because you have to get a certain amount of mass in order to support the increasing weight that you're holding above it. So, when you enter the building, you walk through these, very large kind of thick walls that are there to really support the building. And today with steel, you really don't have to do that. Alternatively, you'll see around Manhattan, you'll see these very airy and lofty lobbies of large office buildings with a lot of glass and light that pass through it. So maybe if we use that as some kind of theme and thinking about how what technology of today is potentially limiting the next wave of architecture, potentially the way that architects create. One thing that I think is somewhat interesting, if you look at some buildings and how they've manifested, you can kind of tell which ones were built before, computers or 3D modeling software, because really you're only thinking in particular views, right? Typically plan from above, looking down, sections cutting through a building, even through elevations of the building. So if you were to look at the work of Zaha Hadid, whose work is very free floating and tons of curvature and complex structures, much of that wouldn't really be possible before computers. Even if you look at her own work, I'll pull something up here, you'll see that her earlier work is much more kind of boxy and it isn't as fluid. So, these are some of her earlier drawings, and we're just, on Google looking at early work by Zaha Hadid, and fairly not super original or not super dramatic compared to her work today. Great. Yeah. So you can see much more wavy. There's a lot more complex forms. The materials are being tested and woven in ways that you definitely don't see in typical buildings. So anyways, we'd love your thoughts on that, the limitations of architecture. And we've also read some literature before jumping in. Maybe you could tell the listeners about that.
Sure, absolutely. And as always, welcome to Gradient Proof. We're happy to have you along with us. Just by way of a little additional background, Roy and I, as always, have some similar experiences, but different experiences. Roy having studied architecture more formally, while I have not. But in preparation for this podcast, what we have done, kind of at Roy's recommendation, is we've looked at Dan Cruikshank's book, History of Architecture in 100 Buildings, that was published in 2015. And we'll probably be making reference to a few of these buildings on this podcast. We also read The 99% Invisible City, right, by Roman Mars and Kurt Kohlstedt, right? And this is a field guide to the hidden world of everyday design, particularly in city design, right? And that's kind of also a little bit of additional background.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So just curious, Stephen, taking a look at these books, what were some things that stood out to you or were interesting as kind of a first pass at the information and
sure,
seeing it for the first time?
No, absolutely. And I enjoyed both of these books quite a bit. It is kind of refreshing and a little different to spend this amount of time reflecting on reality that is architecture, right? And they kind of both appeal to me in 2 different ways. Obviously, a history of architecture in 100 buildings kind of highlighted in what I would kind of view as, Dan's canonical take on, what are the representative and I guess referenceable buildings, right? of the world and styles that go along with that. I think one thing that kind of jumped out at me is, whether unique to Dan or not, right? Certain countries and particular cultures that seem to feature again and again. And in other instances, some countries that seem to be a little bit absent. That was one thing that jumped out at me. The 99% Invisible City, in a very different way, we're both here in the city of New York, and in my own experience, having lived in other big cities like Shanghai and Hong Kong, it was very interesting to kind of look at that world around you in drawing attention to things that at least I don't often think about, right? Mm-hmm. And I thought you did a really good job of not just kind of presenting kind of almost and I should say they because it's a collaboration, but kind of presenting a comparative urban framework to think about cities more generally, but also providing unique histories as to how some of these elements kind of evolved into the way they are, and how sometimes it seems to be quite arbitrary, if you will.
Yeah, definitely. So one thing that's, and this was not intentional in any way, but the two different pieces we looked at, one being, the 100 buildings, which focuses on, very specific buildings that are, extremely kind of relevant or have many lessons within them. And then also on the other end, reading and studying 99% Invisible, right? Which is looking at those kind of unspoken for buildings, the artifacts that exist within the world that just are background noise to most people who are unaware of them, right? So if you think about, I guess, what is the power of architecture and its ability really to influence everyday people, right? For instance, I could show you the Eiffel Tower and you could instantly know where it is in the world, right? Or you could imagine what the cafes that surround it are like because it's located in Paris, right? Same with a certain famous opera house, right? That initially automatically lets you know it's in Sydney and where it may exist. And these buildings become significant because you could say they're landmarks, right? They call some kind of visual. Interestingly enough, they're visually unique, but they really start to then describe the culture of that space, right? So you only have one Eiffel Tower in all of Paris, but the Eiffel Tower is in Paris in so many different views, in so many different ways as a cultural icon. But you don't see it being erected all over the city, just like the Sydney Opera House. There's only one of them, but it doesn't necessarily call out the Australian architecture. And then you have buildings who are significant and also beautiful in their own way. You have the Pantheon in Rome that is an incredibly beautiful building when you enter its space. I don't know if you've been there, Stephen, but one of the oldest concrete buildings in the world. And they say as concrete sets, it gets stronger every year. So potentially the strongest concrete in the world as well. It's interesting when you look at those kind of more artifacts and celebrities, I guess you could say, of architecture. And then on the other end, what about the buildings that kind of surround them and what role do they play? Right, which you could say you experience more so than the main attraction. It's kind of like that quote that people go to see the Grand Canyon and they travel from all over the world, but they on average spend 6 minutes actually looking or in the Grand Canyon.
Sure.
Right. So you could make an argument that the travel to there, the experiences before and after those 6 minutes have also something to do with kind of the experience of whatever the main show is. So those are just some initial thoughts. Did you have anything on that, or we could maybe put it on the list?
That is kind of interesting, and I like your 6-minute analogy where my apartment is very, very close to the Empire State Building, mm-hmm. right? And that certainly, perhaps like the Eiffel Tower, is a building that communicates a sense of the city of New York internationally, mm-hmm. right? Yet, although I've lived in New York now for well over 10 years, right? And I have certainly done meetings in the Empire State Building, right? How much have I truly interacted with that building directly mm-hmm. During my time in the city, right? Yet it is kind of representative of creating that zeitgeist of the city, which you and I have interacted with quite a bit, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess one question that I think all architects ask themselves is, how do you make the best form of architecture possible? And I guess to some degree it depends, right? Someone may think that the Empire State Building is a great piece of architecture, right? But if you look when it was built, by the way, it was built in about 13 months back in 1931, around that area, or around that time. It was built extremely quickly, but that was right around the Great Depression. Mm-hmm. So it was seen as an economical failure. I think can't recall the nickname they had for it, but it was something fairly negative, right? So at the time, it was maybe seen as a failure, mm-hmm. maybe even a huge statue of failure, but then years later becomes this icon for a city and potentially changes how other buildings are built around it, right? Right now, sure. There's still some fewer buildings that kind of block it in mid-Manhattan. So, you also have the Eiffel Tower, which was initially built for, I believe, it was one of the World Fairs, and Parisians hated it, wanted it torn down, but then after some time, decided against it, and now it's what you'll find on tchotchkes and souvenirs that are sold all over the city there. So, the interesting kind of love-hate relationships with cities and their architecture, and I guess maybe those work as beacons to some degree. But when you look at good architecture from an architect's point of view, you're essentially looking at, you typically have a plot of land or an existing building that you're tasked to go and work with. And, I think an issue that artists always, or will sometimes say they run into, is that it's an open canvas. So therefore, it can be anything. And that is both a blessing and a curse, right? Because in what way do you let it lead you in one way or another? So the beauty of architecture is that you have different forces that then kind of push the ideal design or what could be good design out of it, right? So you've got the climate in which it sits in, right? If you design a building in the middle of the Sahara versus in the Alps in Switzerland, you'll have different forces, and some forces that you can bring in. Sometimes you may want to bring in water and harvest it. Other times you may want to push it away. So then you also have the cultural forces, right? How do people interact with space, right? What is their thought of a bedroom, right? A bedroom in the 1950s in America versus one today may be seen very differently just as far as the size requirements. Now you have more of a tendency to have more space for a desk, or each child has their own room versus sharing a room. There's these cultural aspects that then drive how things are built and designed out. Also, for instance, if you were building a farmhouse that were to take care of animals, right? Those are additional forces that then push on how to make the most efficient space, right? So there's this idea of how do you formulate the space without looking at the visual aspects of it, in that it's the most efficient for its inhabitant, right? And I think one of the difficult parts is, there are some specific moments where, let's say maybe a museum is built around a specific collection of art, right? So then you build the walls in a certain way to frame the very specific paintings within that collection. But if you were to build a tower to essentially be apartments for people of all types and sizes, you wouldn't build it for only families that have one child and whatever the parameter is, right? So in some ways, you have some architecture that's built really to kind of be as open as possible within the limits of the efficiencies of the economics of building it in order to appeal to the most amount of people without shutting them out. So you have those. And then also, when you jump into the more visual, and we can jump into kind of some of my thoughts here on how a lot of this could be transcribed into AI and essentially have an architect AI. But you also have these kind of visual requirements of the culture, right? If you look at Roman columns built in Roman times versus columns maybe built today, if you look at I believe it's the Villa Savoy by Le Corbusier, who was one of the first people to take the columns from the perimeter of the building envelope and bring them inside, kind of making the columns maybe less as significant as they may have for like the Pantheon, for instance, which has the row of columns at its front elevation. Instead changing that relationship and making glass and lightness be the envelope versus the structure that holds up the structure itself. So there's all these different aspects that come into it, and I think there's really an artistic and an engineering side to it. Some architects may say that it's never art; it's always engineering, and it's always kind of somehow a scientific response. But there's a reason every architect that takes on a certain building is going to come up with a different result, and it's never typically the same. So those, I guess, are some just quick observations. But were there any buildings that jumped out to you specifically in the books, or one that maybe was new to you?
Well, yes, in the 100 buildings, there certainly were a few that were new to me, right? And we could probably go through and talk about some of those. I mean, it's kind of worth noting that earlier we spoke to the Empire State Building and the Eiffel Tower, neither of which feature right in Dan's list here, right? Which is perhaps not really that surprising to me. Let's see. What kind of, I mean, he kind of creates categories around the way he kind of talks about these different buildings, kind of looking at, the material by which they were constructed, right? Buildings dealing with the sacred, right? Kind of representative of different faiths, and also, kind of was considered a little bit more pioneering. Trying to think about what we could kind of drill down on, right? What you tell me? I mean, is there any particular building that you would like to discuss?
Yeah, well, I guess there's a lot of, to some degree, when you flip through the book here, you see that there's many millions, maybe strokes of genius, but there's one kind of identifying factor of some of these buildings, or there's one kind of feat that screams the most, right? So I believe he called it the Flatiron Building, right, which is like the shape of a flat iron, given the restraints of the site there of the two avenues converging. Right, you have Maison de Verre, which is essentially an addition to a building in Paris that has this huge glass brick wall, which I've actually been there, and I worked on a project where I had to model essentially the whole thing from scratch in 3D. So that was a very intimate look at that building. But interesting strides to that make the buildings kind of significant. You've got the Chrysler Building, right? With, of course, its historic top with the different way that finishes, and I think they're very expressive ways of these buildings coming together and doing something interesting, or maybe culture shifting in the way that architects think things are possible. So to some degree, you have those design elements that break a frame. Then you also have those technological ones like steel that we spoke of, Villa Savoy that really looked at detaching structure from the envelope, and you have the elevators, of course, bridges, concrete use. Once you have the 3D computer that changes the way that buildings are constructed or thought about. Also 3D printing technology, just even being able to fully see how that would potentially look outside of maybe a computer screen or a 3D model, which takes much longer to construct. That you also have virtual reality, right, which is used by architects to experience spaces beforehand. Because imagine building a multi-million-dollar building and then really only experiencing it truly once it's actually built, right? Of course, images, renderings, things like that give you some sense, but there's nothing like being in the real thing. And it's actually one of kind of the greatest joys of architecture from an architect standpoint, I believe, or at least for myself, when you spend that time, months, years, whatever it might be, building out a space, and then finally, once the scaffolding comes down, you walk through it, and hopefully you've kind of predicted everything correctly or designed it to the spec you thought was right, because sometimes you won't understand something until you're actually in that space, right? Sure. Maybe how different spaces connect, but that really depends on the view in which you maybe were looking at it.
Yeah.
You've got Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright, constructing itself over falling water, right? I don't know if it's a stream or river that comes through it, right? An interesting way. And you might ask yourself, so, why is there not a falling water? Why doesn't every home get built that way, right? And, there's certain complexities and cost effectiveness that don't exist to kind of build such bespoke pieces of architecture, right? So to some degree, there's this path of least resistance, right?
Sure. I mean, another thing that jumped out at me were kind of some of these pieces that were not necessarily lost, but seem to be non-referenceable for a very extended periods of time. Like, so for example, when he writes about the minaret of Jam in Afghanistan, right? And he made the comment that while this is very, very old, right, it was kind of unbeknownst or not really referenceable by the wider world, right, for an extended period of time, right? I think the Petra, kind of the particularly that relief that we see now in kind of almost has a Indiana Jones like common currency within the popular culture, right? I think that was kind of more or less out of sight for, if I remember correctly, almost about 1,500 years, right? Where he made a comment that it largely been looted, etc. But it just kind of the non or kind of the inconvenience of the desert-like location, right? It wasn't really a place that people were just at least in the popular context just stumbling upon again and again and again, right? It was just out there, and that to me is kind of fascinating, where you think about these great works that just kind of go extended periods of time of more or less being off the grid, so to speak, right?
Right. It's funny. I almost started thinking of the opposite, right? Which is now you've got these buildings that are potentially built for the exact opposite, right? For it to feed into maybe its ability to be seen all over the place at many times through maybe some social media app like Instagram, right? If it becomes a idyllic place to take a photo or create some kind of social media post, that could almost be an incentive, which may not lend itself to the actual feeling of the space, but more so the way that it's built out to kind of lure in those people. And in many degrees, that's doing the opposite of, instead of being kind of tucked away by whatever circumstance, it's instead allowing it to scream itself outside of its biggest limitation, which is architecture's biggest limitation, which is location, right?
Sure.
Much of architecture doesn't move. You kind of move to it or through it, where some of the advertising through these great experiences, or what look like great experiences, would essentially drive more people to it, which makes you think, right? Is good architecture, or maybe it doesn't even have to be good or bad, but just for different moments in time, there's some architecture that you maybe want to be an architecture for one, right? For instance, it could be a burial site of your life partner or something, that it's not somewhere you want people flowing through like a subway station. But then a subway station itself has to be built in a way that's so open and clear of obstacles that it allows for the easiest flow of people in and out, right?
Sure.
So,
well, another thought on that's kind of interesting, where you highlight Instagram and social media in terms of encountering different places that may be out of mind or otherwise. I mean, one of the things I kind of think of is Never been to Cuba, and I've never been to Iran, and
Mhm.
obviously a big part of that is the geopolitical restrictions to the ability to travel easily to such places,
Mhm.
right? Yet, however, I feel that particularly in the last 10 years, right, it, the postings on an Instagram, on Facebook, have provided a unique sense of exposure, or even in some cases intimacy with certain places that ends up being quite ironic, right?
Mhm.
Because here you're talking about a place that is restricted by sanctions, right? But seeing something, you can Google it, right? And ironically enough, through none other than Google Maps, which doesn't have a particular operating presence in these places, yet has a mapping functionality that is forever collecting photos and other things, right?
Mhm.
That you can kind of look at, in this case, different Persian, architectural pieces from hundreds, if not almost millennia ago, right?
Mhm.
If you will, right?
Right, right. I mean, what's interesting too is, and this was a kind of this company I started years and years ago, but it's essentially a geolocation application where you would kind of leave notes and pictures and
Mm-hmm.
experiences in 3D space. So you would use your camera and it would essentially open up like an AR background. And the thought was that it never took off, or it didn't push forward. But essentially, the thought was after some time, if you had enough people taking photos in a space, you
Mm-hmm.
could then use those photos from all those different angles to actually
Sure.
reconstruct 3D spaces that you could later access, right? And now I think even with the advancements in AI, you'd probably need fewer reference points to be able to actually build out what a 3D space may look like, right?
Sure.
How does that become of use? I guess unless you
Yeah,
want to
and,
jump on it.
and, and maybe, yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, because that's always been something that's been of interest to me. If you remember, I believe it was back in 2007, 2008. His name was Blaze, who did the Photosynth project, right, which was a sub project of Microsoft,
Mhm.
which was really about that. It was about the stitching together of different photos, right, to create three-dimensional point clouds of a place,
Mhm.
right, and he would kind of provide these TED Talk like experiences. And I remember I myself in photography would also try to take a bunch of photos, and you could kind of download the software and kind of stitch it together,
Mhm.
right? And I think what also becomes interesting in that, where going back to Dan's book, he actually ends on talking about this the ancient city of Hatra in Iraq, right? And he laments, as he does in many places, right, the recent destruction of this very, very ancient city by the time of ISIS, right,
Mhm.
between 2015 to 2017, right? And it's interesting to well, also think about the sadness in certain things lost, but to think about maybe on a technological level how things could kind of be brought back, right,
Mhm.
in the context of we have many of this photo and video like content, right?
Mhm.
We can recreate these kind of point cloud immersive experiences,
Mhm.
right, to things that have been lost either through acts of man or natural disasters,
Mhm.
etc. Should
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. So, I guess what will be interesting is, for maybe a person to sit there and analyze all this data or
Hmm.
photos that from millions of different people, and then build it into some kind of updated chronological life, right? I mean, what it kind of draws me to is, let's say, for instance, you are whatever age, but you pick up a photo, and the photo itself is static, right? But let's say you almost wanted to relive that photo
Hmm.
through like some kind of film, right? Maybe there's a series of photos throughout the day, and you could upload that into an AI
Hmm.
that would also kind of know the geolocation. Maybe you feed it to it. Maybe you could just map it to the millions of points in Google Street View and find out where it actually was.
Sure.
And you give it a little bit of a description, and then you can sit there and relive that experience with whoever that might have been. And you have the photo and maybe even a voice recording of the people there.
Sure.
And before you know it, you're watching a movie on an experience you had back then, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, are those things out of question? I don't think so. I think that's probably a product that just ties in an LLM or a couple 3D softwares and Midjourney and things of that nature, Runway
Sure.
maybe, that turn that into a reality. Right. So, anyways, I think there's it's also, if you think about how somebody maybe sits in a space, if you take a photo of somebody in a Parisian street versus a New York City street, I think anyone who's lived in either could probably look for certain things that call out one over the other, right? The way people sit outside, the chairs, the way they dress, the style of the architecture of the stone or the glass used in the surroundings, the cars, the taxis. maybe even the species of pigeon and squirrel. I mean, all those things kind of tell a picture visually, like a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? But if we could just jump back to kind of some, I think, really interesting ways to think about architecture, and then maybe where it may be going. So, when I was in architecture school, one of the first tasks we had, it was essentially a list, right? And if we could zoom out and say that they pretty much wanted you to design a home, but they didn't describe it that way. They would say, design a place to eat, describe a place to relax, a place to sleep, a place to work, a place to love, whatever, all these different things. And really what they were trying to do is change the way, or, if they labeled something like a bedroom or a guest room or bathroom, or you would have all these ideas, preconceived notions that were built in to what you may develop, right? But if someone says, design a place to sleep, people sleep outside under the stars, in tents, in train cars, in all these different places, right? But if you were to look at whatever the piece of land or place you were building and take it those different forces that exist there to kind of mold what you were to design, right? Like, let's say you were sleeping somewhere that had very little light pollution, right? You may make the ceiling above you when you sleep as transparent as possible. So when, before you go to bed, and instead of looking at a ceiling, you're looking at the stars above you, right? Sure. Or let's say you were in somewhere where you would see the northern lights, right? Or let's say, alternatively, you were designing a place to sleep, in a mine cave, right? You may, in fact, make it as concealed as possible and drive certain kind of like oxygen systems in there, and maybe some different ways that kind of change what the space kind of requires for the best possible experience. So anyways, I mean, going back to that, thinking about different ways that people inhabit space depending on the space, part of me wonders if those things can be computationally obvious or programmable at some point, so that, even having some of those pieces of information, you could design the most optimal home with the help of an AI. And I think you could. It's more so just, thinking about even what we talked about a little bit earlier, which is you have spaces that are built kind of more generally so that they can appeal to more people. So how could you make a space that was built more specifically, that was still economical? So you've got a few limitations. You could say the first one is design. Someone would have to sit there and understand the input of the person purchasing, right? How specific do you make the house versus how general, right? And then also the ability to build it, right? If somebody wants certain materials over others, or if those walls are built with standard construction or 3D printed construction or whatever it might be, and maybe those economies that go into those different types are different than they will be in the future. But it would be interesting if, you could develop a very specific architecture for people at the same cost, but actually be able to do it that's more specific to them. But then also at the same time, if they were ever to leave, be able to then kind of reform it or rebuild it or whatever it might be, without a total loss of those materials or the way that things are structured and laid out. So, I guess what I would say is, if something's built more generally and it's driven by economics, right? You build something, you want to sell it enough so that you can continue to build and live another day. But, I guess I'm trying to think of the technologies that you'd have to kind of absolve of hardship in order to be able to make more specific or great architecture, right? Like, even if you look at maybe some of the old churches, Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, and in Barcelona, the Gaudi cathedral there that's still under construction. I mean, those are exceptional pieces of architecture, very specific, and obviously not so, not every person could live in something like that or even call for that. But those experiences that you feel in those spaces, how could you kind of democratize that in some way that you have these great architectural feats in everyone's home versus only in the center of a society? So, I think we'll find ways to eventually peel back those limitations, because why not, right? And if the design is happening instantly through some kind of AI spatial syntax layout that allows it to all kind of connect in a way that's maybe more specific, right? You enter the formula with, this is me, this is how many children I have, these are the activities I like to do, right? You don't want to buy a ranch with a bunch of boating warehouses on it if you don't ever choose to buy a boat, right? But you may repurpose them into an artist studio or indoor shooting range or whatever it might be, so you're using that space that's more generalizedly built. But
no, that's kind of interesting to think about. I mean, pushing ahead in a different sense, I kind of wonder if, when we think about the reconfigure spaces that can be reconfigured, right, and how over time it seems that we continue to move in a direction where, if you think of, in ancient structure, maybe a kind of a stone or marble house, right, in the context of Rome, right, it can certainly be idealized and beautiful, perhaps not, but it also, marble doesn't lend itself to being repurposed into a different configuration relatively quickly, right? Versus the types of places we live in today, right? Every 15 years, if you so choose, you could kind of redesign your kitchen, right, with both the latest styles and personal preferences. What kind of also intrigues me is thinking about William Gibson kind of has his Jackpot trilogy, which was the Periphery being the first one, or the Peripheral was on Amazon last year, and that is kind of a future reality in which matter assemblers are a real thing, right? As is the presence of AI, right? So maybe you have a living environment that either on a daily or otherwise could actually adjust, making rooms larger, smaller, even making additional rooms, etc., right? Where, if you're coming over, the house can create a guest room, right? And then when you leave, right, that space could be reutilized toward another purpose, right? Because we could all agree guest rooms are nice, but when you don't have guests, they're somehow inherently inefficient, right? When that space could be utilized, even if it's to give the living environment greater space, right? You don't need a room at this time, which could be kind of exciting. Right?
Yeah, definitely. Especially the quality of the guest room is maybe aids or does the opposite to keeping guests there, depending on the type of guests, I guess, that are visiting. But
and to that point, maybe if you come over, I can choose to create a larger guest room would make sense in my day-to-day. But, I can optimize more for your comfort during your time of stay, including, ironically enough, I mean, in a truly reconfigurable environment, I could actually make my room smaller, right, for total square footage available toward you having a more, a larger setting than you might have had, right? And then once you leave, I can make my space optimized to me again, and in your space is no longer yours because you're not there.
Right. And I think what you're talking about is the quality of space, and really also the quality over time, right? A room built for a child 20 years later doesn't have the same, it's not as effective as it was when it was initially built, right? So we kind of naturally and organically update things over time, right? Somebody buys a 2-story house and then they get too old and then they put in a ramp or one of those elevators thing, along the stairs, right? So kind of adjusting to the use of the architecture over time. And so it's funny because we kind of do it naturally, but it would be interesting if there was a way to allow the actual building itself to kind of react to that beforehand, right? I mean, obviously taking a 2-story building, turning it into one has different complexity measures there as far as, removing an entire floor. But if there was, I guess the question is is the building of the modularity that you would build out, or however that were to transform itself, whether you have, double walls and then the walls kind of slide out or extrapolate and, carry forward that, a roof and also and there's definitely ways to do it, modular ways to do things like that. But I'm trying to think how that could potentially happen from a material sense, like expanding rooms and things of that nature without it being kind of this rudimentary kind of, rail system or something of.
Sure. And I think to that, coming back to the idea of matter assemblers, right? This, for William Gibson as being, a hypothetical reality in the year, I think it's 2099 or 2100, right? So the wall is actually being built atom by atom and then being deconstructed, right? So it's not a question about moving things in and out. But you are right that within a present moment, right, we do have that type of limitation, right? In terms of, yes, it'd be kind of a, and you do see that in conference rooms and banquet halls, right? One wedding may be larger, another meeting or even a wedding may be smaller, and there are dividers that can kind of come up and repartition a space, right? If you will, right?
And I think that's a perfect example right there of essentially, architecture being limited by the technology that exists outside of architecture, right? Like the industrial steel, elevators, escalators even. I mean, there's certain things that, certain architecture that could never exist without those things. So you could build that 300-story building, but no one would be brave enough, maybe except for David Goggins, to run all the way up it. And then you're left with getting yourself back down. So where it kind of changes the relationship of the architecture, right? Maybe a 10-story walk-up, the 10th floor is seen as the least desirable, even though the view may be better, but the effort that it takes to then.
And it's funny you say that because in the book, The Invisible City, this is actually brought up as an example where in a pre-elevator world, right, if you checked into a hotel, you would probably want to be best at ground floor, right, because you're not walking up and down stairs all the time. But when the elevator arrived, and Otis's braking elevator in particular, right, all of a sudden the penthouse suite became the most desirable, and it could be rented out as such, right? And being on the ground floor for a variety of reasons is usually less desirable, right, if you will. Right.
Which is interesting because it starts to reflect more of, even if you look at the human body, right? Your brain is kind of the most elevated part of your head. Your feet are at the very bottom. They get the most sturdy. They are the closest to what is the earth, right? not saying there's fully a direct connection to that, but there may be more trouble on the ground than there may be up in the sky, metaphorically. No, that's great. I'm trying to think of other innovations that, obviously, the use of concrete, steel, were more physical kind of material, glass as well. There's of course innovations there with, you'll see buildings in New York being built, and you've got eye bars and being built with 6-inch thick. I forget the terms, but the thickness is preposterous. But it's engineered out. It's so that you can have that airy lobby and still have a 70-foot building above it, somehow floating above. So those are interesting parts of architecture. And then maybe do you want to talk about anything you saw in 99% in the book there, as far as things that you're now noticing that maybe you weren't before?
Yeah. So, for example, he highlights a variety of different things that I wasn't aware of. One of the things he talks about is this idea of Knox boxes, and I guess I had never really thought about it, but effectively a Knox box is a box in which the keys to the building are available, right? And the local fire department or other kind of EMT personnel would have the master key to these boxes. And the reason being is in the event of fire, right, if the front door is locked, right, the fire department needs a way to get into the building pretty quickly for the purposes of lives and or fighting the fire. And rightly, he kind of points out that these exist. And I think walking around the city, right, just kind of, once you kind of start seeing them, you just kind of see them all over. And I guess I had, it's one of these things where I had seen these boxes before, but I never really thought about what their function was. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So that kind of jumped out at me.
Right. Hidden in plain sight. I think he also talked about like street markings, right? The different colors, the indication, right? If you see D, that indicates depth, depending on, different letters there could be electrical, sewage, whatever it might be. So somewhat an X-ray into kind of what's beneath you. But for the everyday person, just, becomes a piece of the background, right? Anything else past that jumped out to you?
I mean, he also talked about over the development of things, particularly the electrification of cities, right? And the need to kind of build these power substations, right? And in some cases, he said, you actually have houses, right, that are not houses as such, but historically, within there are all these transformers and high voltage cabling coming in, right? But rather than alarm the surrounding community, which would have implications for property values, etc., these were purposefully disguised to look as houses, right? And what's kind of interesting about that is over time, some of these operated many years as kind of being the literal home to these transformers in the middle of these communities, right? And then as the technology just continued to evolve, right? In some places, they eventually finally did become homes, right? Where the internal electronic or the internal power systems were kind of pulled out. And what else are you going to do there in the middle of that residential community but make it into a house? Right. Which it had been a disguised house for almost a century, and now it's a real house. Right.
It also makes me think of computers, right? The initial computers were the sizes of rooms, and now you've got one in your pocket, one in your ear pod. When just the size of these things do eventually change, right? Which again is also kind of an influence on the architecture, right? If you were building the offices of IBM when computers were the size of rooms, you'd have less place for people to sit. Whereas now, it's a different equation there entirely. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what I call path architecture potentially? So,
sure.
Essentially, if we were thinking about how do you build a language of architecture into an AI that, and this is something I wrote back in college, but essentially, if you find a way to distill down space and experiences and things like that, essentially there's kind of two divisions of looking at architecture. There was path architecture, which is more the fundamentals of space and different parameters in which you could think of how a space could be organized. And then you had experiential architecture. So the idea with point architecture or path architecture is that you have kind of these key nodes, these categorical fundamental building blocks that you could use, right? So a point, right, could be like an event, right? Like entering a space could be a point. A transition in a space could be a point, right? The closure of a door to make a room private, like a bathroom, or public, like a living room, would be a point. And then theoretically, or thinking about lines as connections of points, right? So you enter the home, you go to the next point, which is you enter the kitchen. Next point, which is you drink water. Blah, blah. You break down these micro events within the space, and then you can kind of look at the object that's moving along that line as having certain characteristics, right? So theoretically, the way you traveled into this podcast room could be built out specifically just to fit your body movement, but it wasn't built out like that, right? There was additional space, which is
Sure.
the experiential point, to make it a comfortable experience for you to actually walk through those different spaces. Then also there's a plane, right? So essentially like a surface, and that can be kind of, it could be transparent. It could be like, for instance, if you go to one of those parks and you're looking at those, the safari parks you can drive through where there's like lions or whatever it is, a very different experience if your window or that plane was not there, if it was open versus having some kind of degree of separation physically, right? And then, mass, which is essentially like a collection of planes. So the thought is like you could program in when you're developing out space, different, like you could analyze their events and points that they exist in the day. How many times do they eat, sit, this, all that. And by analyzing that, then you can make a connection between those points and create the most efficient space. There's also some of those points may be generated because of the existing limitations of their environment. Like you may walk up twice as many stairs as you would in one house versus another because one has two set of stairs versus one, or because it connects two different things that you're traveling between, right? So thinking about those different types of parameter points that could be programmed based on data on how you actually live your life, or the way you want to live your life, right? You could almost say that architecture to some degree drives you to experience things that maybe you do or don't want. You want to get to work in the morning. You don't necessarily want to smell, whatever lives in the subway, but you use that as the most efficient way between point A and point B. So all those different kind of parameters. So how would you design, even just if you think about this, right? If you wanted to lower your commute, you would decrease the distance between the 2 points of you living and you working. But then if you didn't mind, or if half the fun was the journey or whatever it might be between those two spaces, may be completely different, right? From the bottom of the mountain to the top it's not necessarily being at the bottom or the top. It's more so the journey in between the two. So you think about those different experiential, the value and parameters based around whatever the significance of those points are. So, and then, you could see a way of like very unique architecture being formulated based off each person, based off of those parameters that they want. There's also this idea of, if you were able to kind of do a series of tests to see what things made you more excited. Maybe you don't like working out, but you design a house that in order for you to live your life, you end up working out based on the slope of one space from the other and just traveling between those two, or the type of air or elevation angles of the way that you sleep or what you're exposed to within that space. So that's all more of the underlying kind of tightness of how you connect those spaces and those events. And then the other aspect of it is experiential architecture, which is looking at kind of those themes in experiential space, right? So if we sat here in this podcast studio, which is a fairly small room, and had this conversation, it would be a completely different experience if all four walls dropped down and we'd be in the middle of the Coliseum with or something like it with a theater of people then watching us discuss ideas, right? So same kind of point space connection between us and kind of the conversation we're having. The difference is the experience of what's around you and how it kind of affects the mood and experience, right? Also, if living in a house of different styles, right? If a house built during Art Deco period versus the Baroque. So the food in front of you, right? The nutrients, the protein that comes in from a elk versus a chicken. You're still getting the fundamentals there, right? The protein, the nourishment, and all those. The experience in which it kind of manifests in the way that it's presented kind of changes the experience there, right? From a flavor standpoint, like what does flavor have to do with, like, I guess how would flavor or that? I mean, it's more so of it's not a requirement, right? It's a outcome of culture of different ways that things are prepared, right? If you go to certain areas, you'll eat certain types of food based on maybe the food that lived more locally to it.
No, that's kind of interesting, and it's interesting to think about that idea of heat mapping or otherwise to kind of observe the way the way you or people more generally are encountering spaces and the efficiency or inefficiency in the way spaces are kind of laid out. I mean, coming back to this 99% invisible city, he highlighted something that I wasn't aware of, but apparently when it snows, what people like to do in terms of city planning is go out and take pictures of either sidewalks or streets to kind of look at how are spaces truly being utilized, meaning, are people, cutting over here, right? And thereby maybe that would be better served if that was a sidewalk. Or inversely, are, cars, even though they have all this available space to drive on, are they in fact repeatedly driving on a smaller amount of space, which lends itself to the idea that maybe, curbs could be kind of expanded for additional greenery, or maybe even whole lanes might not be necessary and that could be repurposed for some other function, right? Whether it's a bike lane or again additional sidewalk or wider sidewalk or planted trees or whatever you want to do, and in taking picture of the kind of the tire tracks and the footfalls in the snow kind of prompts these type of questions that could be kind of investigated, if you will.
Yeah, 100%. And I remember like on college campuses, you'd have this big patch of grass, and instead of somebody taking kind of the surrounding walkway around it, they took the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
And then eventually you would see, the grass would essentially reside, and it would be more of a kind of a dirt path that then maybe also lend itself to people taking that who maybe wouldn't have initially thought, right? So like it becomes a trail so I guess the question there is, was the architecture or the person designing it, wasn't taking that into account? So obviously, I mean, there's ways around that, right? You could turn that grass patch into a pool and put piranhas in it, and then no one would cross that way, right? So, but in specifics as far as walkable area, people will kind of forge their own path. You'll see that even on trails, right? People finding their own way through the brush or whatever it might be that is potentially more efficient. So that's kind of an interesting back and forth, because then what do? Do you give in or let it be, or because especially like for instance college campuses that have they want everything to look a certain type of way, especially when people are coming to check out the school or whatever it might be. Like I would remember our college would always switch out the grass before orientation, right? Or before, whenever people were making decisions. You don't want to show up and invest money in a place that can't even keep the green lawn or the green lawn green, right? So, and I guess you could ask questions of like, maybe that's an inefficient surface for the space, right? Maybe it should be, let's say it's in a desert climate, more cactuses and that type of foliage or whatever that might be. So it was actually interesting because it was the mall at the University of Arizona. And before I got there, years and years before, they built a new student union. People would actually really like settle down on that lawn. They would eat their lunch there. Students would sit there, and it would be completely full. You could almost not even see the grass anymore because everyone would come there and sit down. And then when they went and built the new student union there, they used that area as a place to store kind of materials and construction equipment, things like that, to build a new student union. So, because construction takes so long, after 4 years, let's say when it was built, maybe longer, the people that knew of that culture of using the lawn as the place to be a place to congregate and sit and eat didn't even know that was really possible. So nobody did that anymore, right? Nobody sat there. It was seen more as this pristine piece of grass that's not meant to be walked on unless there's an easier path to go through. But so, and the only reason I knew about that is because of, a professor had shown a photo kind of calling that out from an architecture standpoint of, how a space and the culture of the space, not even the greater area, how that could really change even within a few years. Just, because why would anybody before the creation of that new student union do that? It's because that was the culture of what people had done before, anyway. So, and there's also like Frank Lloyd Wright, for instance, who, built homes with roofs that would angle in order for you to kind of push you to sit down in certain parts of the home. So the whole, like the way the roof was thought of was, where you should stand and where you should sit or lay down or whatever it might be. He also said a lot of things like anyone over 5'6" was a waste of material to build for, as far as height. I think he was shorter, and he didn't like to build for taller people, right?
Indeed.
Yeah. So, I guess building can also be a little bit aggressive too.
And it's also interesting to think about the idea, coming back to Dan's book, he highlights a particular house being built in Italy during the time when Mussolini was there, and then the owner losing access to. But in a different way, it was actually designed to encourage people to access. So Casa Malaparte, to kind of encourage people to go up to the roof. But being that the house itself was up on the top of a mountain overlooking an ocean, right? While certainly certainly interesting, could also be quite intimidating, right? Meaning that would you necessarily go up to a roof, right, on the top of a high mountain, right? But whether intentionally or otherwise, there was a visual obstruction to almost encourage you to kind of, ascend the stairs, not necessarily experiencing that dimension of fear, but once you had come to the very top and you came around the thing that was obstructing the view, so to speak, you were already present on this roof and had kind of, committed yourself to experiencing the environment from that perspective, right? If you will.
Right. Yeah. I mean, even think about how architecture speaks to you as a person, just in significant buildings, right? If you go through a neighborhood and you see that there are iron or steel or metal bars on the windows, what does that indicate to you? Maybe that, not that necessarily, it's trying to keep people out, right? Whereas if you go into a different type of neighborhood, you might see that there's no such thing, right? So there's little kind of hints of architecture, right? It's still a home. It still has whatever the requirements are of that jurisdiction as far as what's required for it to be considered a dwelling unit. But the quality of the space and the way that that's done is kind of speaks also to the climate itself. So if you see a home that's completely glass, right, like Philip Johnson's house in Connecticut, completely glass head to toe all around, there's a little sense of voyeurism, right? So, and it may be that the person inside was the one who was looking to peek out, but what ends up being the unintended circumstance is that you then become the viewed, right? The people that
Sure.
look at you versus you looking out. So, and he actually, when he first built that house at night, it was so dark outside that just the way that glass works, when it's dark, you see more of the reflection than you do see through it when it's dark, right? So he ended up putting floodlights outside of the house so that
Sure.
when he was looking out, it wasn't.
It's also interesting to think about that in terms of environment. The other day, and I think it may even be available on Airbnb, but there's another glass house it looks quite beautiful, but it's also in a setting that's quite a bit more remote, right? Where it's one thing to have a glass house in Connecticut and you're in a community and people are driving by. It's a very different experience perhaps to be in a glass house in a remoter part of Montana, for example, and nobody is going to come by, right? So you allow yourself the continual enjoyment of the surrounding, but it's your privacy is allowed for, even though the material would in another setting suggest otherwise, right? If you will.
Yeah, definitely. So it's the same way you see also the response to that, right? Whether it's the floodlights or it's blinds on your window, right? During the day, you'd like to look outside, but at night, where kind of the visuals are not really in your favor, right? It's you turn it around. It's the same way, like if you look at a glass during the day, it's harder to see in, but at night, the light coming behind that glass illuminates better what's inside. So then you see blinds and there's other architectural or physical manifestations to kind of react to that.
And to that point as well, when you talked about earlier how architecture kind of reflects the technology, we talked about matter assemblers earlier, but we could also imagine a reality in which glass that could change its opacity on command, right, would lend itself in terms of providing the best of all worlds, so to speak, right? So you could have maximum visibility when lighting conditions were appropriate, but as night came, right, you could have a variety of responses, including glass that only allowed a one-way view, so to speak,
right?
Which could be kind of interesting from a living perspective. Maybe at this time, being that this is gradient proof, usually we take a moment to highlight the drink of choice, right? And today, Roy, you brought Knob Creek's number 9, being that it's been aged 9 years. This is a Kentucky straight bourbon, right? Produced by Beam Suntory, of course, of Suntory Holdings from Japan now. But,
really?
Yes, so the distillery is Claremont, Kentucky, and it's a small batch bourbon. And as always, good to do this podcast with you. Cheers.
Cheers.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't realize this was the 9-year-old, aged 9 years.
It is. Unlike some of the others we've had on the show, Knob Creek 9 is a little more recent. It was introduced in 1992. And yeah, it's kind of what we're drinking today.
That's great. That's great. So where should we go next?
Let's turn around in a different way. I kind of hinted at it earlier. So I kind of went through and looked at the 100 buildings that Dan kind of highlighted. And what was interesting to me is you see certain places or countries or cultures that feature again in terms of architecture. And then to be candid, you have other places and cultures that seem to be noticeably absent, if you will. So for example, without even having the lists in front of you, if you thought about architecture, you could think about, Greco-Roman traditions, right? And how that's been of influence. Egypt certainly highlights as being pyramids, right? You have different religious traditions that highlight Judeo-Christian tradition and also Islamic influences, right? Japan stands out as it does kind of here, and Europe more generally is present as we'd expect. But what's kind of interesting to me is that, looking at this list of 100, it's kind of interesting to me that I don't see South America, right, with the exception of Peru,
Machu Picchu?
Yes, which we could probably agree is certainly unique, but I don't know if that would be the most representative lineage type. Like for example, like do people talk to the Machu Picchu school of architectural design. Maybe not, right? Or at least, Africa. I don't see here, again, excluding Egypt. I don't know. What do you think about that, right? If you will.
Well, just as far as specific areas not being called out.
Yeah, and it isn't really about the one or the two, but like architecturally, as we kind of sit here in New York, right?
Right.
In the West, are there certain architectural expressions that are unexpressed here, or just unexpressed generally, or what would we think about that?
Right. Well, I think the tough thing is, as
Yeah.
well, is this is a book written by an author
Sure.
who chose 100 buildings that may have been kind of relevant to their education or their outreach experiences. So it may have been that the school that they went to, or things that were out of all the millions and billions of things that have happened over time, just didn't that just didn't end up in their curriculum, or end up being something that's more specific. But it seems like the ones that were included were pretty similar to what you would see in many different architecture schools. Like,
Sure.
I'm looking at the Lloyds of London
Sure.
right now by I believe it's Richard Rogers, who passed away only a couple of years ago. Yeah, Richard Rogers. And essentially, that building was significant because, and this was kind of like Renzo Piano. I think they were working together on the Centre Pompidou, which is in Paris, and is famous for, just like the Lloyds of London, taking the systems of the building and putting it on the outside. So you have the HVAC, you have the electrical, the stairs, and you can see it's wrapped in stainless steel.
Mhm.
And those are actually the exit stairs to get out of the building in case of an emergency, right? You can see here the pipes of the HVAC and all this. So, I mean, that building was a statement, right? It was kind of like an artist statement of do the opposite of what's in, or what's popular now,
Mhm.
right? And does it make sense to move cooled air or heated air that you're trying to contrast from the environment further into the environment? No. I mean, most HVAC systems, or any of that support system, is embedded in a wall that's insulated from the difference in the air, right? I mean, you could put it on the outside, but you would be using much more energy. It'd be less energy efficient to reach the desired temperature as it moves through a pipe that's also exposed to a different temperature that's differing than its own. So, I mean, I'm also, it's been a lot of these buildings I'm looking at again now for such a long time, that I haven't for such a long time. But it seems like each of the ones that are shown here kind of have that statement where they change the way that either people thought about architecture or space, and they've kind of went on a limb with whatever that technique that they used might have been, and that changed kind of the way that architects think about designing going forward, right? So you also look at Islamic architecture. I mean, I think there's a lot of Islamic architecture in European architecture, a lot of ornamental design and the use of patterns, and you see a lot of overlap there. Obviously, just with all the trade that was going on between the Middle East and Europe over thousands of years, right? And then, of course, you've got just different materials. I mean, you'll see different inventions of spaces, or spaces used more so in certain areas than others, right? Like the courtyard is specific. You've got the Great Wall of China, which is kind of a great wonder in itself. You also have the Pyramid of Gaza. I mean, the interesting thing is, if you think about at least what we think we know the pyramids were built for today, it seems fairly inefficient use of time, space to build this huge multi-million-ton structure for the death of, or a tomb of one person. So that's kind of a different cultural kind of reason, like that would never happen today. Even if we could build the pyramids over,
Sure.
would we? I mean,
Well, let's drill down on that when we talked about it wouldn't happen today. What's kind of interesting to me, right? And I had this conversation with a friend is the creation of the pyramids also an example of a lot of ancient capital without anywhere to go? I mean, certainly it's incredible and we appreciate it, and it'll probably outlast all of us, right? Because how long do you think? I mean, the pyramids are probably going to be around for another 15, 25,000 years, right? Everything else may be gone, but the pyramids are kind of still there, right? If you will. But in another way, it's kind of interesting where would you do that today? I guess the question becomes is, when you think about the richest people in the world, Elon Musk being one of them, right? He invests money into a lot of different things, and people have debates on the usefulness of what some of his interests are. But you don't really see him, saying, I'm going to put $100 billion into the creation of a tombstone. Because, again, there's so many other things he can do, right? I mean, maybe he could build a pyramid on Mars, right? But case in point, right? It's more of a, like, you can send your capital around in so many different directions, right? Versus in the ancient world, that certainly was an undertaking in both earthly and in human capital capability. But was it a question of lack of imagination, or just the inability to invest in the next possible thing? Not saying life comes down to investment, but clearly you know, it's kind of
Right.
water everywhere, but
Yeah.
what are you,
Yeah.
what are you doing but
Right.
making a tombstone?
No, 100%. I mean, you
Yeah,
can even see it in
yeah.
like churches, right?
Sure.
Like you see that a lot of the times, some of these historic churches all across Europe, I mean, they have incredible detail, but then you look at the, everyday person's house and it's built of totally different materials. I mean, another thing on that is, one of the reasons I think the pyramids have lasted so long is because of the material that was used, right? Buildings made out of steel and wood are not going to survive, thousands of years, hundreds of years. They're
Mhm.
eventually going to, succumb to the forces of the environment, right? Whereas stone, is, it's essentially it's rock, right? I mean, it's got a much, of course, a river can cut holes through it, but only after thousands of consistent flows of water. Anyway, so you know when you're building, let's say somebody's home, it's not necessarily that you want to build it with you're building it out of whatever you need to do to make the sale, right? Essentially, to some degree, or whatever the culture expects, not necessarily for longevity purposes. Even today, when you see kind of more higher end homes, you'll see them where the facade is built with the marble or some kinds of stone, but not necessarily. It's not that the wall or the kitchen sink or whatever is actually built with that stone. It's just a veneer, right? Even the brick is a veneer. So that's a little bit. It's different. But I guess it makes you wonder, like you said, like unlimited capital,
Sure.
and also slaves, right? That built it. What does that do as far as where a society spends its time building it? Yeah, it's interesting.
It is interesting. I want to ask another question related to architecture, and I mentioned Mars earlier, right? At what point, right? And I understand it's kind of more of a debate about what is architecture, and architecture, I guess, is always going to have a functional dimension to it. But at what point can we talk about identifiable, observable architecture on the moon or on Mars or on some other environment? Because at least initially, although you will encounter the exterior of your living environment and other environments, right? You're not going to encounter it in the same way you do here on Earth, right? Meaning that you're in your bulky or hopefully less bulky, extra spacesuit in this case, right? And you're not really out there, literally and otherwise stopping to smell the roses of the construction, right? And it's probably going to be quite utilitarian in what it is, down to the ounce, right?
Right.
At what point? At what point? And what would that kind of look like?
On Mars or in space or
yeah, and or does it happen, or does it not happen to a much later point where, like, do you have to first terraform Mars before, like, architecture is really an external pursuit? Or is it a luxury, in fact, right?
Yeah,
that takes a long time to come to that type of environment.
Right. I mean, even look at the International Space Station, right? I mean, it's not exactly, draped in velvet, right?
Sure.
Everything there is extremely efficient. There's constraints and efficiencies that you have to be able to work around. And I think it's going to be the same thing in Mars or any of these other climates. I mean, when you build something, you need materials that can be constructed, right? So what is something that you have a lot of on Mars or some of the other planets that maybe might vary from Earth? Well, you don't really have trees that you can then produce wood.
Sure.
And then you probably don't have an abundance of certain types of metals to create screws and all these things, right? So, I mean, there's some ideas of like, you take the sand or you take whatever the rock is there and you find a way to heat it up enough that you can extrude it out of some kind of extrusion device, maybe like a 3D metal 3D printer, masonry 3D printer, and then build out some kind of structure that, can, house and protect it.
But to play devil's advocate, if you had that, right, and I knock on wood, that's going to be available, even if you could create material, would the question of a larger aesthetic, right, be deemed an inaffordable or inefficient luxury?
As far as like the spaces being larger potentially?
No, I'm not just talking about the creation of larger spaces, because again, the creation of larger space could have a direct arguable utility to it. I'm just talking about the external, back to your space station example, right? The space station doesn't really look, I take that back. It looks cool, but I don't know if it's the aesthetically the most pleasing. At what point, at what point does it become a question of external design? And then the inverse question is external design for whom? And is that an affordable luxury within this space? Right, because it literally is a frontier environment. And when you think about frontier housing more generally, it's not really, it's hard to think of.
Right. It's there to protect you in order for you to move on to what you're doing next, right?
Right.
Or the frontier you're moving towards, right? So, they're obviously like, the frontier of the American West was different because, there's a constant need for first travel to
Sure.
move. So you had to construct something that would come up quickly and disappear quickly, right? Which could have been a teepee or something like that, right? Which Native Americans used for a long time. Anyways, but it's different in space where you need something that's more strategic or more solid in the sense of security, so that you can run those experiments, which are happening more like a tent. We're coming up and you're constantly testing different things in that different environment. So, I guess I wonder, what was the original question here?
Or is the exterior the wrong way to think about it at all, right? Maybe, does Martian or lunar architecture become defined by the configuration of an interior space? Because in terms of aesthetics, that's all that really matters, right? The exterior is just functional.
Well, you could say the exterior of a home too is functional, right?
Sure.
The roof is to keep out, the environment, the rain, the whatever, right? But sometimes roofs are metal or clay or shingles.
But the difference here, I'm wondering, is if in other words, if it's difficult, if the observation of structure requires suiting up, right, and going outside to take in the site, is the pursuit of a beautiful aesthetic experience in that context an idealistic pursuit on a design side, right? I mean, what you choose as an individual is fine. I mean,
right.
I think it'd be cool to kind of take in the Martian horizon, if you will, right?
Right.
But that's different. Martian horizon exists.
Well,
right?
I think you said it earlier, which is, that aesthetic design is more of a privilege. Right?
Yeah.
It's, first.
So when does that happen, though?
No,
or does it happen?
Well, I mean, look how it's happened elsewhere, right?
Sure.
Once there's some kind of stability in or maybe it's more efficiencies. And, if you were traveling into space, the first thing you would want to make sure is that you could breathe, right?
Right.
And then after you could breathe, it's probably, can you store food? Can you, the hierarchy of needs kind of happen there, right?
Sure.
Whereas, first it's survival, and then eventually it's self-actualization, which is, let's test things we've never tested. Let's find out the limits of our capabilities, right? And trying to find out, all the science experiments they do in the International Space Station, as far as how do things grow in space? Can sex lead to whatever, having children in space, whatever it is, right? Like all those different things become tested, but eventually when it's understood and the transfer of people to space is kind of more common, it'll probably change. I mean, look at that. Look at the ship that imploded on the way down to the Titanic. I mean, it was a very bare bones ship. I mean, it was, there was a joystick controller that was used to navigate it, right? Or up and down or whatever it was used for. But then over time, if you look at, maybe like ships that were used across the ocean versus ships today, you can go on a cruise ship and ride a go-kart and hit some golf balls on the top of it. And that additional level of experience was built onto it. But initially it was like, how do we get from here to East India or whatever it might be? And it was probably less glamorized or experiential.
Which kind of introduced an interesting question. I mean, looking through this and where we are at this particular period of time, can you think of, and if not, why not? Why don't we have good examples of quote unquote underwater architecture, right?
Underwater architecture?
Yeah. So to play devil's advocate, I mean, you go back to a comic book reality of like the 1940s, the idea of an underwater city, right, in a Tom Swift type vein would kind of have a kind of a tangibility to it, an idea to it. I mean, why the heck not, right? And I'm not necessarily making an argument for a full underwater city. I mean, that's more of a question of economics. But it's also kind of striking to me that when I think about it, I can't really think of any like broadly identifiable example of some form of underwater architectural creation outside of, again, maybe a James Bond movie, but again, maybe not recent, right?
Yeah.
It's more of I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, right?
Yeah, well, I think it's about the path of least resistance, right?
Sure.
Is it easier to build something above ground than underground? Yeah, when you
Fair
build
enough.
underground, right,
Sure.
there's a whole list of issues from a structural, from a visual standpoint. We like our windows, so if you want to put a window under the water, it's got to be, X amount thick.
But
it's
even in a
be structured.
limited case study sort of way.
Sure,
right?
I mean, there have been, but
Yeah.
you know what I think is interesting, just looking at those projects, like I think Snow Edda did this underwater, this restaurant.
Sure.
And like you look at the photos and it's like, wow, like there's this huge window and you're under the water, right?
Yeah.
There's also there's underwater hotels, but to some degree, depending on where you are, it's a desert under there. Like you look out the window and it's just nothing.
Okay,
And
fair
so, like if you wanted to make it like what I think we both think of it, or we'd like it to be, is like you go down there and there's like fish and octopus and sharks and it's just like, it's an aquarium, right? But the truth is like in the ocean, it's, it's not all there all the time. It may not just be as exciting as you'd hope it would.
Sure.
Potentially. Like I wonder like if those underwater kind of facilities ever bait fish in to make it more interesting. Because you get down there and it's like you're pretty much looking at a desert. There's no activity. It's just blue. There's nothing there.
That's fair. That's fair.
And that's just what I've seen, because I was like, oh wow, this is so incredible. You see the
Mhm.
renderings of it. There's like, Finding Nemo and all his friends swimming around and like, a shark and whatever. And then when you go and you see what it actually looks like, and it's like there's nothing there. So I don't know. I mean, it's also the construction of the glass and
Mhm.
enclosures. I mean, it's just much more difficult. Like if you like most walls are a couple 2x4s, a couple sheets of plaster, and that gives you like a sense of security. But
Mhm.
you take a sledgehammer to it. If you've ever seen someone demolish a house, I mean, it takes like could take less than an hour to demolish an entire house that somebody thought of as their fortress for 50 years, right?
Sure.
So it's funny, the idea of architecture and security within it.
Now, when you talk about aquarium, that kind of makes me think of something else. We're a few blocks away from here.
Mhm.
What was Manhattan Mall is about to undergo a conversion, where this is going to be the largest indoor aquarium in the world. At the moment, I think the largest one is in Chicago. But in addition to that, what's going to be unique about this is there's a unique, I don't know if it's plastic or glass, but there's a unique technological advancement, which is actually going to allow you to kind of walk through, wherein you'll have literally a seamless experience where the fish and the shark and etc. will be swimming all around you, right? And that's going to be literally tons upon tons upon tons of salt water, but you'll be able to kind of walk through and experience it as if you were there, but obviously not in the water. Now, what actually becomes kind of interesting there is if that becomes a feasible reality, obviously the maintenance of aquariums is not an easy thing to do. But when you think about maybe an AI regulated reality with materials to match, right? Do we have above ground buildings of the future, right, that allow for, very large aquarium or aqua integrated experiences within the very design of the thing, right, to unique effect? So you go to your local mall, for example, right, and an integrated part of that is fish swimming around and stores in the middle, right, and you kind of walk around and the fish are going and you're walking through and it's certainly in its advancement on material science and capital to boot, but it could experientially it could be quite exciting.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I mean,
it's so funny you say that, because it made me think. So there's a time when I graduated and before I landed my first job, I was writing these articles about like experimental architecture, and one of them was called the teleportation house. And essentially, the idea was: is each space of your house in the most optimal place for it to be? For instance, would it be better for your kitchen to be right outside a farm where the ingredients you used were actually sourced, or would it be better for you to sleep in New York City or in a floating apparatus in the sky? And the idea was like, what we do now is we bring the world to our home. We order things online that are built in other countries. We put olive oil from Italy or wine from France. We bring all those things to our home. We're constantly bringing in the world to us, right? But the thought was, if like let's say teleportation was a thing, and you could jump through every time you walk through a point or a doorway, that was a teleportation device to wherever the place was that you were going. Then those different, you would be closer to the source of those experiences. Right.
And I like it. And to that point as well. I mean, if unwinding at night, now we go home and you turn on Netflix, right? But might you not be better served, even if you live in New York City, to unwind on a beach in Maui, for example?
Sure. Right? Or go into an air gap in a cave underneath the ground where it's so incredibly quiet, or it's warmed by the core of the earth, based in relation to it, to the perfect temperature. But the reason it made me think of that is because the pool house in that sketch was essentially this room, and it was like a living room underneath it. And then the pool was actually above you and dipped down into the space, and it was clear. It was completely clear. So like in the rendering, there's like a mother preparing something, and she's like pouring wine or whatever. And then beyond her is this pool that dips into the space with her kids swimming in the pool. And then beyond that, you've got like, a desert climate behind you, right? So it's like this, like what is the perfect space for every activity? And then like how much of a home would you have to own theoretically if some of it was private for you only versus specific to what you wanted to do? So that whole idea of like actually being able to connect to those different spaces, instead of bringing the world to you, you go out to the world and you experience those things. Like I think the toilet was like in the middle of the rainforest, so you've got the rain going to help you kind of alleviate yourself, right? And then there was also like animals walking around, but you were like in this glass enclosure just to use the restroom, and then you walk back through to teleport somewhere else. Because if you think about it, every room you walk into, I mean, typically buildings or homes are designed with the same theme, but this kind of like, how would you build that today? And without the use of teleportation, you'd have a house that like you could call like schizophrenic. Every room would have its own personality and be completely detached from the other personalities of the other rooms, you know? So, I mean, those were just like thoughts of theory of where this can go with no limitation. And that's fun, I think, because then it makes you think of, you do bring the home into or the world into your home.
What about a middle point where we've talked about AI, but we haven't really talked about, I think, let's talk more about augmented reality than virtual reality, right? Where when we talk about the reconfigurability of the home, we could well imagine in the not too distant future, the ability, so, when we look around this room, for example, and you highlighted, we could be in the middle of a stadium, with the right contacts, right? And, the studio could be reconfigured a number of different ways, right? Where we could kind of be, having this discussion on a virtual beach, say, right? And then going back to the living environment, depending on time of day, etc. Maybe with teleportation not being possible, knock on wood yet, you could have the psychological change to that environment, right? But according to time of day or purpose of day, if you will, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we've had like conversations here about like simulation theory and all that, but I think the augmented reality would have to be convincing enough. It's like you see those videos of the person who puts on the VR headset and then they walk on a theoretical plank in their living room,
right?
And they start shaking because they believe, at least in some part of their brain, that they are on that ledge about to fall off, right? So, it's the question becomes is, when does it become good enough where you're actually convinced, at least from a underlying level, that what you're seeing in front of you is really there, right? And I mean, how could you use that to soothe yourself, right? As far as, let's say you're nervous for public speaking, and instead of walking out to a room full of people who want to listen to you speak, it's you speaking to a friendly, familiar voice, right? Or something like that, right? So that changes not only the environment, but also changes kind of how you react within it, right? Versus...
But playing devil's advocate, I mean, are there middle steps along the way, right? Meaning that I understand the plank reality, and I've actually, had the VR headset on and walked out on a plank and different things, such like that. And I understand is it good enough to make you think that you might fall? But there's also, I guess there's also a middling reality where if we could reconfigure our perception of the walls around us, to be honest, the stakes aren't that high, and thereby, is the requirement 100% buy-in, or is the requirement more of a psychological optimization toward whatever the functionality is, right? Or if we're trading stocks, do we want to have like stock tickers all around us, for lack of a better phrase? So depending on what we're doing at a particular moment in time, we can further optimize the reality around us to be an extension of that, right? Or encourage an extension of that.
Right. And I guess you could think about, like, you already have a lens in which you see the world, right? Like, for instance, I guess, I don't know, did you ever have like an 8th grade lawn in your middle school?
Oh, you mean where the students grew things?
Yeah, like the older students would have like a specific area that only they could go. It was like the 8th grade lawn. So my middle school, the way it was shaped, like it was kind of central. So whenever you walked from like one class to another, you kind of had to walk by this lawn, and you would see these like older, mature kids, right, comparatively, right, were there, and it was almost like a little bit of a theater to it, because you were walking by these like group of people that were stuck there. But let's say, for instance, you were a teacher and you were walking by it. It was very different, because there's like, oh, just some kids. Who cares if they're in 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, whatever it is. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I think we create our own filters in the way that we view the world based on our perception, and that changes the way that we experience the world, right? Somebody who grew up on stage in front of a lot of people, speaking to a lot of people, versus someone who was maybe an only child, isolated from a lot of exposure to different peer groups, will have a completely different view of standing on a stage in front of a million people and performing. So it's like that augmented reality is kind of already embedded in the way that we see the world. I'm not saying like overriding it, but it does change the way that you experience the space. Someone that goes in one situation has a panic attack, other person thrives. Why? But as far as actually like overlapping that with information, you could think about, I don't know. The thing that gets me with AR is like, do people use it on their phones? I developed like an app for that with the text and images and all that. And even I wasn't using it that much, right? Because like, you kind of want it to, like, it needs to skip a phase, right? It can't be this like additional thing you put on. Like, I want Neuralink to like overlap things in front of me while I'm talking to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Neuralink just like, pushing it through and analyzing. I mean, imagine that with AI. You and I are sitting here, maybe you speak an entirely different language, and it's literally not only changing the input that comes into your ear, but also visually putting it in front of you. And let's say you're describing it, like if earlier we were describing like the teleportation house or whatever, and it was actually what we were thinking together, or even what you're thinking internally, you could then visualize on a 3D level.
Mm-hmm.
And because think about all the dead space behind us now. We've got white walls behind us.
Yeah.
That's not really being used as input. So, you could be talking about some kind of experience, and behind you could then illustrate whatever that experience is and kind of build a more substantial case or experience in that conversation.
Thanks for watching. More episodes are available here on this platform and other main platforms where podcasts are heard. Thanks for drinking with us. Stay hungry. Stay foolish.